I guess if I can just make other people feel a little more seen than they did, then I'm glad.
I'm delighted to be speaking with Jenny Chi, poet, writer, and scientist. She's the author of Focal Point, winner of the 2020 Steel Toe Books Poetry Award. A freelance writer, her essays and poems have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, San Francisco's Asian Art Museum, and numerous other publications. She's working on a hybrid collection titled Liminal Bodies, and a memoir in essays in conversation with her late mother's memoirs of the Cultural Revolution and life in Las Vegas. Jenny holds a Ph.D. in Biomedical Science from UCSF and has worked as a cancer researcher and medical writer. Jenny, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to thank you for writing Focal Point. You share so much vulnerability, pain, and grief with your readers. It's a real look into the human experience. What was it like to put pen to paper during those years after your mother's death?
Thank you for that question and for saying that. I actually didn't write anything for about a year immediately after my mother died. I think I couldn't stand to be in my head long enough to do that. But after a year, I started writing again, and it was more of a compulsive thing than anything else. I did it because I had to, because I didn't have another outlet for it. I was 19, just about to turn 20 when my mom died, and I didn't really know very many people in a similar situation. I didn't have particularly close family relationships outside of my mother, and I just didn't really have that much of a community. And so writing it sounds so cliche, but writing was the only way for me to survive that.
Wow. You lost your mother at such an early age, and it's actually something we kind of have in common. I lost my mom at 25 to pancreatic cancer, and I'm so glad that Dominic Lim, another Ampersand, connected us. I know you did your research in pancreatic cancer as well. I have found your writing to be able to kind of put into words some feelings that I couldn't, not being a writer. What do you hope that your writing gives to other people like us who lost moms at far too young an age?
Well, first, I'm so sorry for your loss. It's always kind of bittersweet to meet someone who has that shared experience. It's like I'm glad to not be alone, but I'm also so sad that this is why.
Mm-hmm.
It was an extremely isolating experience. I think grief is maybe always an isolating experience, no matter how old you are when you lose someone. I wrote this because I felt alone. What I hope from it is just that in reading this, other people going through similar things can also feel less alone. I think the only things that really helped me back then were reading works by other people who had experienced loss. I read Cheryl Strayed. That was maybe the first thing I read that even remotely resembled my experience. Because at first, I was reading a lot of grief poems and memoirs and essays by older people, because that just is more common. The older you get, the more people you lose. And when I read Cheryl Strayed, I think I started with Torch, Not Wild, her novel, I felt a little more seen. So I guess if I can just make other people feel a little more seen than they did, then I'm glad.
It's so important. I know it just came out rather recently, but Crying in H Mart was another one for me that someone had recommended, and then I almost felt a little scared of it because I hadn't read it yet. But then when I read it, I think I actually went on Instagram and like DM'd Japanese Breakfast and said, thank you so much. And who knows if she ever read that note, but it mattered to me to be seen in that way. What have you heard from readers or people who have attended your poetry readings?
I have to think about this one because this book came out in 2021. So recent, but a few years ago. It was such a whirlwind. I think a lot of people that I've heard from are also poets who didn't necessarily have the same experience, but I definitely have met wonderful friends, not necessarily through the book, just through poetry in general, who similarly experience loss at a young age. There's something about that like turns people to the arts, I think.
Oh, how interesting. I think it is a way to express that maybe the emotions that you don't know how to express another way. Wow, I had never thought about that. Well, your book, Focal Point, it's a reference to a science term, and you are a scientist as well. You finished your Ph.D. in Biomedical Science from UCSF. Not an easy feat, and definitely during a time of your life that was also incredibly difficult. What was it like doing that heads down work, working in a lab? What was it like during that time?
It was a lot of things. I think in the beginning, it gave me both purpose and distraction. I'd actually been pre-med my whole life, like very reluctantly, but, you know, Asian parents, there was a lot of pressure. I did all the pre-med things. I shadowed during college and all that. And I just never really wanted to do it. I think my heart honestly was always in writing and the arts in general. There was a brief period when I wanted to be a studio art major in college, but my mom had gotten sick right when I started college. And I didn't really feel like I could make my own choices when she was sick, and I didn't know how much time she would have. I ended up switching from being pre-med to applying for PhD programs, in part because of her illness, and also in part, I guess, as the lamest sort of rebellion ever against being pre-med. So I started grad school just a few months after she died. I felt a lot of pressure from myself mostly to do cancer research because that was how she died. And in the beginning, I think it helped in some ways to have the structure of grad school, to feel okay, this really terrible thing happened to me, to my mom, to my family, and now I am able to do some work to maybe prevent this sad thing from happening to someone else in the future. So in that way, it sort of gave me purpose, gave me structure. In grad school is also kind of all-consuming. especially like my experience of it, it felt like you were expected to make science your whole life. And I didn't want to be reminded of the rest of my life. So that kind of worked out in the beginning. But I think after I started writing again, started processing my grief a bit more, the all-consuming nature of that life wasn't really working as well anymore. And so then I needed something else. I needed the writing to help me survive the emotions, the grief that was finally hitting me after I had numbed myself for a little bit.
Well, it sounds like grad school provided kind of a structure and stability for a time that otherwise felt pretty chaotic, right? And that's it's an interesting reflection to think back on. A lot of your poetry is inspired or kind of directly lands the reader into the lab or into these science-based environments. How do you think your depth of knowledge and experience in science has helped you as a writer?
You know, it's funny that you mention this. I didn't realize until I had written all these poems without the intention of writing a book necessarily at first. And then someone, like a mentor of mine, David Watts, he's a physician poet at UCSF, and he ran this workshop just like out of his office every Monday after the workday. And one day after years and like going to this workshop every week and bringing a poem every week, he was like, "So where's your book?" And I was like, "What book? I'm not writing a book." But then that like got the wheels turning, and so I started putting it together, and I had really kept my science and writing lives very separate before that in my head. So I didn't realize until I was putting it together, and I didn't put all of my poems in this book. I was like taking poems out, putting some back in, or putting others in. And I was like, oh, I guess I did write a lot about science. I guess as much as I tried to keep these things separated in my head, I couldn't, because this was just my life at the time.
Yeah.
But that's not quite answering your question. You asked me why or how science has helped my writing. And I think it has helped me have a different perspective, and also has given me different vocabulary to draw from than maybe writers without such an intense science background. Sometimes like the metaphors that I use or words that I'm exploring the etymology of, they come from my science work, and I don't really think that hard about it or about the fact that it's coming from science. It's just, this is what I was thinking about. I'll give an example. There's a poem in this book called Transplant, and it is about both being a transplant in California and comparing it to heart transplantation. I brought that poem to workshop. One of the other people in workshop, who is now one of my very close friends, I still remember her comment. It's like, I could never write this poem because I didn't have that knowledge about heart transplants and how they worked. But I get this, like, metaphor so well now that it's on paper. When I feel weird about splitting my attention and my time, I always just remember this comment of hers to remind myself, like, okay, doing these different things, it's a strength. I'm not like taking away from anything. I am adding to my knowledge base.
Let's take a moment to reflect on this question. When have the arts provided a balm for you during a hard time? Outside of hosting this podcast, I partner with leaders in the workplace to turn professional challenges into leadership successes and career progression. I love working with executive leaders, aspiring C-suite professionals, and of course, ampersands. If any of this sounds interesting to you, reach out to me at jessicawan.com. That's JESSICAWAN.com. Now, back to the show. Jenny, you and I talked about you reading one of your poems on today's show, and you were so gracious in letting me decide which one. And I had said the poem 1 year later had really spoken to me and touched me. So I would love to hear you read that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for selecting this poem. 1 year later. I still can't smell vanilla chapstick without smelling sickly sweet breath, stiff soiled sheets, and alcohol hand sanitizer, hospital rations beneath maroon rubber lids. I can't hear opera singers without hearing Chinese lullabies, beeping machines and creaking beds, the last voicemail message I erased without thinking. I can't taste orange pulp without tasting tea leaf eggs, cheap acid burn vodka, and salty tears. Bitter white citrus fibers she said were good for me. I can't feel silk scarves without feeling soft, fine hair, cowl horn combs, and Blake journal pages. Creamy gardenia blossoms floating in plastic bowls. I can't see dolphins without seeing seascapes in a Lassen painting, yellow chiffon blouse and mismatched shorts, her hand reaching for mine in a crowded gallery.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was one of the first 5 poems I wrote after my year of not writing anything.
I'm immediately transported with the descriptions that you wrote. It strikes me, you brought this up, you have a mentor who is a physician poet. And I wonder how that helped you see an ampersand path that maybe you couldn't see before.
That definitely helped. I am biased because of what I've been exposed to, obviously. But I was familiar with quite a few physician poets when I was at UCSF. And in part, it's probably because I was seeking out other people who were living this sort of ampersand lifestyle that I was trying to figure out how to emulate. And those were just the models I had. I mean, there were also like others, like C. Dale Young is another physician poet in the Bay Area. I've never met him in person. I had just like read his work. But yeah, having David run this workshop and show that he was doing all these different things, not just being a physician, but also pursuing his other passions, that was really important for me to see, I think. There was less, I felt at least that there was less of that in the research world, or I had fewer models of it in the research world. Obviously, researchers are just curious people, and they like lots of other things, have lots of other hobbies. Like, a lot of people have lots of hobbies, but I think it was important for me to see someone else making a profession out of this other passion and showing that it was possible to do both.
Yeah. You just mentioned curiosity as something that drives a lot of scientists and, of course, writers. What else do you think ties together some of the work that you've gone into? What traits or preferences?
I definitely think curiosity is the biggest thing that ties them together, because I've been asked a lot, like during my book launch, about, commonalities between science and writing. And yeah, I think that's a big one. Just like wanting to think really deeply about some obscure topic and wanting to understand how something works. Like in the case of, my scientific research, it was like curiosity about how some like tiny protein can lead to this disease manifestation. And in the case of writing, I think a lot of it was curiosity about, like, how does the world work? How do people think? How does the brain work? Yeah, so there's overlap there. Maybe what draws me to writing is the fact that I'm curious about a lot of things. And in writing, you can do like a deep dive into some topic of obsession for like a month. You don't have to spend 6 years on it. You can just do a month and like really learn about an elm tree, or like, I don't know, really learn about bluebirds or whatever. And I did a lot of like science journalism or journalism during grad school while I was trying to figure out like how to make these two worlds meet. And that was something I really loved about journalism, was being able to do these like deep dives, but then emerge and then do a deep dive into something else. Maybe some of this is ADHD. I was diagnosed with ADHD a couple of years ago, and knowing that about myself, I'm like, oh, yes, so many things about me now make sense.
How does your ADHD affect or help or change how you show up as a writer, or even your writing process?
That's a good question. And I guess because I've probably never not had ADHD, I don't really know how to compare. I just didn't know I had ADHD for a long time. I guess what I've learned about it in the last couple of years is that people with ADHD are sort of prone to these preferences that I've expressed, like doing these deep dives, having this intense focus for maybe 6 hours where you forget to eat and forget to like do any life things because you're like so focused on writing something or on researching some topic of interest of the moment, but then wanting to sort of like bounce around different topics. I think that's pretty characteristic of ADHD, I've learned. So part of me is a little convinced that like most writers have undiagnosed ADHD, or diagnosed, because I feel like that's just how writers are.
Yeah, the hyper focus and going really deep in one area and being able to emerge too. As a writer, you've found success in ways that we typically think about success. For example, one of your very first essays was accepted into the New York Times Modern Love column, and you've published your first book. How are you thinking about success moving forward?
I think that's a really great question, especially right now, because I'm in this weird time of flux, I guess. You said on a previous episode that you think ampersands tend to be high achievers, I think. I'm paraphrasing. And I definitely found that to ring true for me. I guess in recent months or years, I've kind of come to realize that I have spent a lot of my life being very, achievement oriented, and I'm maybe actively trying to figure out, how to redefine success for myself, both as an ampersand, and I don't know, just to be a happier person. Because I feel like there's this tendency to, you do one thing, you check off this box, and you don't really focus too much on the fact that you were able to check off the box, and then you move on to the next box to check off. I feel like I've spent a lot of my life doing that. So I've never really felt that successful because I just keep moving the goalposts for myself. Maybe how I'm trying to define success for myself is being able to actually be present and celebrate what I have.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much. I think many of us have learned kind of one way to be successful and to achieve, and now it's about maybe unlearning that a little bit and figuring out what the new model looks like for us.
For sure. I am in my unlearning era.
Yes. You and I talked a little bit before the episode about ampersand feelings. I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see them. I know you're currently feeling influx, and I think that this happens with ampersands actually quite often. It doesn't negate all the things you've already done, but maybe right now you're not feeling like an active scientist, right, in the lab, and that's okay. Can you share more about how you're thinking about your identity?
Can I call this an identity crisis? It feels too dramatic. I feel like I'm always having an identity crisis. But it also feels a little true. I think I'm in a place now of figuring out what, maybe not necessarily what I am or what I want to be, but just what my values are, and letting that inform what I do. In the past, maybe I've stayed too long in situations that weren't working for me anymore, in part because I was so attached to certain identities. Yeah, I think I'm just trying to listen to my gut more and not try to label myself so much. I mean, there's a certain amount of labeling that I have to do for branding, I guess, and especially as a freelancer, it's what do I call myself? And how do I market the fact that I have all this science background to lean on for my work, but that's not everything I want to be doing anymore? I don't know. So I guess I'm in a period of just questioning a lot of things.
It can feel uncomfortable, right? The liminal space. But I think we also need to remember that security or stasis is an illusion, too.
Yes.
We're always changing.
Absolutely.
Through these interviews, we are co-creating the Ampersand Manifesto, Principles for Leading a Multi-Passionate Life. What do you think should be included in the manifesto?
We kind of already touched on this, but I think the thing that feels most important to me right now is to try to figure out how to let go of other people's ideas or standards for success. and really redefine them for yourself. Because I think especially for ampersands, when you are trying to be successful, and I have this in air quotes too, in multiple fields, or just to find happiness doing multiple things, if you continue to cling to these external measures, sometimes it kind of feels like I can never really measure up. Like when I was in grad school, trying to do science and also writing, I felt like, it really felt like just, a jack of all trades, master of none. Like, there's a reason for this phrase. Like, I could do a bit of everything, but I could never do it as well as someone who focused like 100% of their attention on this one thing when I was only focusing maybe 50%. I think maybe that sense is also a bit of an illusion, because I don't necessarily think that's true. I think you can just like do multiple things, be good at all of them. At least I'm telling myself this. Like, I think it is possible. But I do think it's counterproductive to like constantly compare yourself.
Yes. Don't compare. Make your own path. I think this has been brought up by so many ampersands, and it's something that we're also constantly figuring out. Mm-hmm. So it's not a solved thing, but we all need to kind of run our own race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if it was you or one of your guests who said this, that ampersands are sort of all entrepreneurs. Because, yeah, like you are forging your own path. Your path does not look like anyone else's, and it really can't. And it is really uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But it hopefully is also very enriching.
Jenny, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Folks, you can learn more about Jenny at jchiwriter.com or follow her on Instagram at Jen Chi. That's JenQiii. We'll link to these in the show notes. If you liked this show, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends and fellow ampersands. And if you're enjoying our show, please consider leaving a rating or a short review so that more people can find out about the show. I had a chance to listen back on my interview with Jenny, and I wanted to share a few key takeaways. 1. The arts as a way through times of grief, loneliness, and isolation. I know in my own difficult periods of life, I found solace in listening to and making music, spending time in nature, and even coloring, something I really loved to do as a kid. It makes me reflect on the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a time of collective grief and suffering. A lot of people got into self-expression, whether that was writing, crafting, or baking bread. It was our way through. 2. Ampersands seeking out other ampersands. It's so great that Jenny has a mentor who's a physician poet. Mentors are very common in one discipline. For example, throughout my life, I've had mentors in marketing and in the business world, and also singers and musicians that I look up to. For ampersands, it's important to also have mentors who are ampersands. They might not even need to be your specific version of ampersand, but someone you admire who is driving forward multiple pursuits and carving their own path. 3. Artists benefit from subject matter that's different from the art. And you get really interesting results the further away that subject matter is. This reminds me of the interview we did last season with Vivian Strauss, who's used her life on a family farm as subject matter for her one-woman plays. Jenny's experiences in the lab and medical world have enriched her writing in a way that's unique, fresh, and unrepeatable.
For sure. I am in my unlearning era.
Yes.